Really, really, really great to see everyone. Lots of familiar faces, some who I haven't seen, some who've traveled quite a ways to be here. It's an honor to do the introduction of the Q&A tonight. Before I start, I'll just introduce myself, Carmen Colangelo, Dean of the Sam Fox School. And I'll tell you something that I've been telling our students and parents this year as we start the year. We've been preparing for this class of students for the whole time the Sam Fox's school's been here, because it's 19 years. So this class was born the year that the Sam Fox School started. It's something to think about, yeah. It is something to think about how much has changed and how far we've come. And our show tonight, I think, is really ambitious and indicative of the aspirations of the school in so many ways. And the most important thing is that all of you in the room, many of you who've lived and been part of this history tonight, share in the transformations that have happened over time and try to, most of you do good and to make St. Louis a better place. So thank you for joining us this evening for the opening of the exhibition, Design Agendas, Modern Architecture in St. Louis, 1930s to 1970s. As Dean of the Sam Fox School, I am really proud of the unique structure that combines the fields of architecture, art, and design along with the Milder Lane Kemper Art Museum. This configuration does allow us to foster unique collaborations in projects like this one, which involves faculty scholarship combined with curatorial and museum expertise. Design Agendas is exemplary of this partnership and reflects our deep commitment to St. Louis, particularly in addressing some of the more complex and challenging aspects of our history and city. This exhibition is the first major effort to examine the intricate connections between the rise of modern architecture, urban renewal, and racial and spatial changes in St. Louis in relation to the interlocking histories of New Deal planning, the Great Migration, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Great Society. Most of our students aren't quite aware of all those movements, but we'll make sure that they are. Tonight, I'm very honored to introduce our distinguished panel, my good colleagues, which includes the co-curators of the exhibition, Eric Mumford and Michael Willis, who will be in conversation with our Kemper Director and Chief Curator, Sabine Eckmann. Together, they will discuss the exhibition and the dynamic yet conflicted period in St. Louis architecture and urban history. Eric P. Mumford is the Rebecca and John Voiles Professor of Architecture at the Sam Fox School. He is internationally renowned historian of modern architecture and urbanism. His many books and publications include Designing the Modern City, Urbanism Since 1850, Defining Urban Design, Siam Architects and the Formation of a Discipline, 1937 to 69, and Modern Architecture in St. Louis, Washington University, and Post-War American Architecture, 1948 to 1973, just to name a few of his books, and there's many more publications. It will suffice to say that this exhibition would not be possible without Eric's vision, deep knowledge, passion, and commitment to the subject, to St. Louis, and to the field of modern architecture to the field of modern architecture. I would like to ask you to give a hand to Eric Mumford for having that vision. I want to say more about each of them, but I'm going to keep it short. But I will say, that Eric is a force, and we're so lucky to have him here in St. Louis doing this work, as we are Michael Willis, who's a fellow at AIA, a NOMA member and founder of MWA Architects in San Francisco in 1988, where he served until his retirement at the end of 2016. Time flies, wow, yeah. MWA Architects, yeah, let's hear it. MWA Architects has developed master plans for mixed-income, affordable housing projects in cities such as San Francisco, Oakland, Portland, and importantly, post-Katrina New Orleans. He's also a principal on major projects such as the International Terminal at San Francisco, Terminal 2 at Oakland, the Oakland International Airport, and several key water treatment facilities, including the San Francisco Southeast Wastewater Treatment Plant located near a historical black neighborhood. And I say that it just as a few things. I think, Michael, you were working on this water treatment plants when I visited you in San Francisco. So Michael has facilitated planning studies in St. Louis, downtown, North Central, and Jeff Vanderloo neighborhoods. Since 2017, he has been a design consultant, so he stayed very busy. And of course, we're very fortunate to have him teach here at Washington University and in the Sam Fox School. Michael's expertise, professional accomplishments, and importantly, his lived experiences, including growing up in Pruitt-Igoe and in Laclede Town, bring an invaluable and intimate perspective to this exhibition. He is a valued member of the Sam Fox School National Council and a recipient of the Distinguished Alumni Award as well. He holds multiple degrees, as many of you know, both his BA and his MArch in architecture from Washington University and now the Sam Fox School, and also an MSW social work from the Brown School. So let's hear it for Michael Willis. And for the Q&A, there'll be conversations with my good colleague Sabine Eckmann, the William T. Kemper Director and Chief Curator of the Kemper Art Museum, who has a research focus on 20th and 21st century art with a particular emphasis on German and European art. Her work aligns with the theme of design agendas showcasing the convergence of modern architecture and visual art in St. Louis during this era. Sabine has curated numerous award-winning exhibitions, and her contributions in particular to this project, like her introductory essay in the accompanying publication, capture the critical intersections between these two movements, often making connections I hadn't thought about before. So let's hear for Sabine Eckmann. And before I turn it over to Sabina, I want to acknowledge the remarkable material included in this exhibition, which draw from the collections of the St. Louis Art Museum, the Missouri Historical Society, and other collections and archives. This exhibition situates some of the most celebrated works of modern architecture in St. Louis within the context of the mid-20th century regional developments utilizing architecture drawings, models, photographs, films, digital maps, and some artworks. The accompanying scholarly publication, edited by Eric, features essays by Chantel Blakely, John Gunther, Kathleen James, Elise Newman, and Michael Willis. Several with us. Let's hear it for all of them. I see Elise. And finally, Design Agendas is made possible by the leadership support of the William T. Kemper Foundation. All exhibitions at the Kemper Art Museum are supported by members of the Director's Circle, with major annual contributions from Emily and Teddy Greenspan, along with additional generous support from Michael Foreman and Jennifer Rice, Julie Kemper-Foyer, Joanne Gold and Andrew Stern, David and Dorothy Kemper, Ron and Pamela Mass, and Kim and Bruce Olson. Further support for this exhibition comes from the Lewin Art Fund and the Ken and Nancy Kransberg Fund, and the members of the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum. So with all of that, I'd like to thank all of our supporters. Let's hear it for them. Many are with us tonight. And again, congratulate Eric, Michael, and Sabina, all the museum staff, as I turn it over to Sabine Eckmann. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Thanks. I would like to start by adding actually my congratulations to this really in-depth and long-standing project to Eric and Michael, the curators of the exhibition. So again, congratulations and thank you for all the time and efforts and research invested. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank really the entire museum team that has worked on this exhibition. It was a major effort. And first, I would like to thank the research assistants, Mary Reed Brunstrom, Leslie Markley, Kristen Good, and Holly Tasker. And then in particular, the designers of the exhibition, Frank Escher and Ravi Gunavardena, the installation team that really has worked for the last several weeks under Ron Weaver and finalized the exhibition about an hour ago. That all was done under the supervision of Kristen Good, registrar for this exhibition. Editors for the exhibition and the reader were Jane Neidhart and Holly Tasker. And I would like to acknowledge and thank very much the education team. In that respect, also those who will still organize a lot of events, in particular a major symposium. Thank you to Meredith Lehman and Matt Bernstein for their efforts and for Jose Garza. So thank you, all of you. Without all of you, this would not have been possible. We have, and I will keep people on time here, about 45 minutes of a conversation. And I would like to start actually my questions in addressing Michael. Michael, you have both a professional architectural history in and about St. Louis, but you have also a personal one. And I wanted to start this conversation by asking you, why do you think that this exhibition is an important one, and why right now?
Thank you, Sabine. I think that this show is about showing how St. Louis was a part of the design movement shaping architecture and cities in the same eras, and to allow us to examine the precedents that still exist. That's what we're going to be showing you. I believe it will give us a perspective about design and get us to ask questions as we bring the lessons into today's issues that form our design thinking. I believe that part of what we can learn from the buildings that we're going to show in the exhibition, if we keep our eyes open and we can understand how those buildings came to be and to use them to answer current questions about design and city building. So I think the program is going to maybe generate as many questions as I'm not looking for absolute final answers. I'm looking for this to open the minds of the people who view it and start some conversations about what it's like to live in the city now and what we do about it right now.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. We thought that it would be very helpful if Eric would give an introduction to the exhibition by using some slides, because not all of you had really had the chance yet to see the exhibition. After that, we will continue our panel discussion, and then at the very end, open the discussion to questions from all of you. Thanks, Eric.
Great. Thank you, Sabina, and thank you, Carmen, for that extraordinary, generous introduction. I really appreciate that very much. And it's also great to see such a large turnout here, and thanks to everybody involved, certainly to Michael and also to many others, some of you in the audience, from whom I've learned a tremendous amount about modern architecture in St. Louis. Since many of you have seen the show, this won't be long. It's really just to kind of give you a sense of what our intentions were in curating it. We began with the kind of well-known buildings that many of us admire and have for many years, things like the Arch, obviously, or the airport by Minoru Yamasaki. And then we also, in recent years, of course, have been very aware, all of us here in St. Louis, of the very dark and negative aspects of these histories as well. The issues of clearance and erasure, all of it somehow part of this period of modern architecture in St. Louis. And so the show attempts to really kind of situate these two aspects of the topic, which were closely tied together. It wasn't like sort of two separate things, but to really try to bring these things together in a single exhibition. So I won't go into a lot of detail about why the material is there. Many of you may know some of the extraordinary things in the show. This Noguchi ceiling maquette, which is in the St. Louis Art Museum. The actual built ceiling still exists in what's now a U-Haul headquarters on South Kings Highway. So I'd encourage everyone to actually go look at that. And we also then found drawings in the archives here that were Armstrong's original office drawings showing how it was going to be built, as well as a note from Harris Armstrong actually commissioning Noguchi for it. So there's a lot of other material. I won't try to go through every project like that, but it's worth paying some close attention to things in the vitrines as well as the big photos on the wall. We certainly wanted to register this whole complex history of Pruitt-Igoe and its well-known demolition in 1972, which was then the critic Charles Jenks in the late 70s identified that as the moment of the death of modern architecture. And ever since, people have been arguing about modern architecture, about Pruitt-Igoe specifically. And so that's all certainly in this period here in St. Louis as well. But we wanted to constantly remind the viewers, and I think the designers did an excellent job of laying this out, where those moments are also counterposed with these extraordinary buildings like Mendelssohn's B'nai Yamuna, now Coca. We're very fortunate to have this drawing lent from a museum in Berlin, or the library in Berlin, where his archives are held. So this has never been seen before, I think, in public, and so it's another rare thing to notice as you walk through the museum. We also found a ton of material, more than we could really use, about urban renewal, about the new highways that Harlan-Bartholomew's 1947 plan proposed to be driven through existing neighborhoods, many of them black neighborhoods. Many of those, of course, carried out. This 1953 drawing pretty much shows the roots of the highways that still exist there today, with all the legacies that go along with that. And again, it's this kind of counterpoint between those phenomena and these extraordinary works. HOK's Priory Chapel, Gio Obata's first major work. Obata had been Minoru Yamasaki's assistant on Lambert Airport. He went on to do this other landmark of thin shell concrete construction, really one of the most remarkable buildings of this kind, of a technique that was being used by Pierluigi Nervi in Italy at the same time. But here in St. Louis, we have these really extraordinary examples, which are almost unparalleled in other cities, including the planetarium in Forest Park as well. We also looked at the Mill Creek Valley, both its clearance and the kind of horrific removal of 20,000 people, the removal of one of the main centers of African-American life in St. Louis in 1959, and also the efforts afterwards. There's quite a lot about Laclede Town, where Michael lived in the 60s, which was an experimental low-rise townhouse community designed by Clotilde Woodard Smith, Washington-based, one of the first women modern architects, as an effort to create an integrated community that would also have public spaces, that would have pubs and coffee shops, places for artists to gather. The Black Artists Group formed and emerged out of Laclede Town, as did the World Saxophone Quartet, which then moved on, its members moved on to New York. So we wanted to register that as well. And so that's all part of this complex history. And there are other projects, too many for me to really talk about right now, but you can go look at them now in the exhibition. Old Man River City of Buckminster Fuller, his whole presence here in the region, which John Gunther has traced in a lot of detail in the catalog, and also then a brief section on the work of Charles Fleming, who through Michael we discovered really. I had been living here for 25 years before I heard of Charles Fleming, the first black graduate of the School of Architecture here in 1961, who went on, studying in the night school, went on to form his own practice, somewhat assisted actually by George Helmuth of HOK, and became a partner in the national firm of Jenkins Fleming in the 1970s, designing many projects, not just here but nationally. Some really relatively small number of his works are in the exhibition, including this comprehensive care clinic that was one of the projects that Michael found inspiring as an emerging architect back in the 1960s, before being another one of the early graduates, black graduates of the school here. So we also felt like we didn't want to end abruptly in 1975, so there's an epilogue section which very, very briefly looks at some of the key things that have happened since then. We've been saying there really could be a whole nother exhibition about the last 50 years here. That includes the Forest Park Master Plan and also Michael van Valkenburg's renovation of the Arch grounds and the building of the new Arch Museum there with the glass facade by James Carpenter. All of this part of the ongoing legacies of this period that also include negative aspects which are recorded in drawings of erasures made by Patty Hayda here on our faculty. So I won't go on at any more length. I think that I hope gives you a sense of what's in the show, and then now I think we can have a conversation about it.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was great as an introduction. I think it has really become very clear in your description what is unique about this exhibition, and that is actually this connection between urban planning on the one hand and individual modernist buildings on the other. And that is new to the field and to the history of exhibitions about modern architecture in St. Louis. And so I thought it would be nice to have a little bit more information about really your selection process, because there is so much from what one could choose and how to connect these things really to, as you already described, this very destructive so-called modernist renewal of cities in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s. And so maybe it's interesting to hear not only about the architects, but also about the commissioners that played a role in both the so-called urban renewal and these modernist structures.
How about this? That was a good question, and though I made notes, it reminded me of something that actually happened on one of our projects, which I'll talk about. And when I have taught here intermittently, I remind my students that I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner. So we treat all the projects that we do in the studio as if it were a project in the city. So we have community members on the discussion team all the way through, not just at the final jury. We have members of the Department of Planning. We have engineers. So we acquaint them with the community that they're going to have to be involved with when they get into practice. And it actually, in my view, is a spur that ignites their curiosity, not quashes it down with all these rules and regulations. I mean, I think that architecture is more than just a single building on its property line, but how it connects to the buildings around it, how it connects to streetscape, transportation, open spaces, shopping, and cultural facility. I was reminded that when we were rebuilding these 470 houses in post-Katrina New Orleans, I was having a discussion with the streets department about how the new underground utilities and the street lights were going to be a part of the new design. And the director said, well, you know, we're not in the urban design department. I said, actually you are. So we had to work with them to say that when we finished our buildings, it's not just the buildings, it's everything that supports it, including the infrastructure. So, in my view, the architects must have an idea of how design should be informed by their own and community aspirations and not just zoning.
Yeah, and to Sabine's point about what was the sort of curatorial approach, A lot of my interests always have been about how design ideas are realized. What are the ideas, typically as sketches or drawings, and then how do those get realized as buildings or artifacts? And so a lot of what's in the show is really based on that. We were really fortunate to get things like a working drawing for the Priory Chapel lent by Kiku Obata, and all the material around Old Man River City. Really, I think it's an extraordinary collection in that way. And also the archives here at WashU have been very helpful in finding Armstrong drawings, Bernoulli drawings, and so on. I think that there's also the whole question of who are the significant figures. We all are familiar with Eero Saarinen, Eric Mendelsohn, perhaps Yamasaki, but also the local figures, of whom Armstrong, of course, is the most well-known, but there are many others, really more than we could actually put in the exhibition, but the timeline is really kind of worth looking at in the lobby, where there's really just an almost endless number of really interesting projects and figures, people like Frederick Dunn and many others.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think it's the moment to also dwell a little bit more on the negative effects of this modern agenda, and that is demonstrated predominantly through urban planning, a very decisive history of racial segregation, large-scale demolitions, massive and repeated displacements, especially of the African-American communities here in St. Louis. So it is Mill Creek Valley that was already mentioned, it's Pruitt-Igoe, and it's Laclede Town that also doesn't exist anymore. So I think, Michael, since you in particular experienced much of that history, and not only learned about it in books like I did, it would be great to maybe have you talk a little bit more about that part of the modern agenda here in St. Louis.
Well, thank you for that, and I have a witness. My sister is here. But I have to start out with my first introduction to Pruitt-Igoe. It was a radically new experience for my family and me. We were the first resident of our apartment in 1956 in this new approach to urban housing, radically different from the neighborhoods we lived in, townhouses, apartments, 3 stories, walkable, and the different from the neighborhoods we lived in before and after we left Pruitt-Igoe. In the beginning, at Pruitt-Igoe, we were all together as kids on the playground because at the time, the Pruitt buildings were for black families. Igoe was for white families. Back then, segregation was legal, but on the playgrounds, we were just all playing in the playgrounds. And we would go to movies in the basement where the parents would set up cartoons and movies, and we'd bring our own popcorn. And we'd walk to school, to Blewett School down Cass, and the Crunden Branch Library, which is also one of the buildings that we're featuring. So it was a new experience for us. But, and when the whole ethos, not the ethos, but when the whole idea of the place changed when white families left the Igoe apartments and it became a totally black neighborhood. It wasn't a neighborhood. The buildings, Pruitt and Igoe, we navigated those changes best we could, but at some point the challenges of living in a disconnected figure ground of a good idea gone wrong, we left before my 10th birthday. I turned 10 on Wabata. So maybe 5 years there, and then we had to leave before it really started to crumble. And what's interesting is that in 1961, even Time magazine knew that Pruitt-Igoe was failing as housing. Laclede Town was different and better in many ways. We were back to living in a village of 2- and 3-story townhouses with shops, laundry, pubs, and coffee house connected to the surrounding neighborhoods, to schools. There were so few kids when we first moved into Laclede Town that all of our classes were in Harris Teachers College because there weren't enough kids to open the Waring School building. So we had our classes in Harris Teachers College and got to hear people like Michael Harrington, the Other America, who was there visiting his mother, give talks about, well, give talks to college students that we got to sit in on. So it was a kind of a magical place to live, and it was an experiment in mixed income, mixed race, wildly talented populations of musicians, writers, actors, blue-collar workers, and college professors. And it was mentioned that, yeah, when we were just 14 and 15 there, we could go to the coffee house and see plays by Camus and listen to first-rate jazz musicians who then, yes, moved on to New York. But this was just the atmosphere of Laclede Town. It was actually kind of magic. It's like a brigadoon. So yes, it took the neighborhood that was there away, but this idea of making a less dense, smaller, connected neighborhood felt more like a place that you wanted to live than Pruitt-Igoe. Astu?
Yeah, so I mean, the planning story is a complex one. We try to cover that some in the reader, and certainly in the big Harlan Bartholomew 1947 plan drawings in the exhibition. It's a pretty remarkable effort to create a decentralized region that was still focused on downtown during a period when the whole region, like much of the country, was completely racially segregated. So the impacts of that we're still living with, that basically failed effort to do that. We live in a decentralized region, but the downtown is not really the focal point. So all of that's part of the story too, and I think that's certainly Pruitt-Igoe's context and the Mill Creek Valley and so on. Those weren't random events, but really part of a systematic effort to remake the whole region in what now seems like an almost crazily ambitious way. So that's certainly part of the story too.
And just as a note, as an architect, we've done projects all over the country, and this didn't only happen in St. Louis. It happened in Portland. It happened in Detroit. It happened in these. It happened in New Orleans, and these were the thrust was to take these formerly segregated communities and tie them back into the neighborhoods that surrounded them, which we were able to do with some pretty tough conversations with the community, both in the former public housing space and then the neighbors around them who are saying, you're going to let people do what now? We're just going to reconnect the streets. We're going to connect. And the playground for the neighborhood is going to be on the property that used to be the public housing site. But you won't see a dotted line. It's just the playground that you can walk to. And it was, I'm not going to say that this was easy. We had some pretty tough conversations. But in the end, it was the community members that said, we're going to do this. So it wasn't just our idea with cool-looking buildings. They had to come to the point where they said, this is our idea, and we want it to happen.
Thank you, both. I think it's a nice forum for this conversation to sort of switching back and forth between buildings and urban planning. And I hope, at least from an art historical perspective, I think it is fair to say that the modern movement in architecture also coincided with the democratization of many European countries. And so from the very outset, if you think about the Bauhaus, for example, modern architectural forms were somehow always connected to some form of democratic social organization. And so my next question is obviously, how did this play out here in terms of the buildings? You know, how did these buildings were supposed to carry a democratic message or articulate a form of democratic life?
Well, it's politically complex. Much of this work grew out of the New Deal. The New Deal did not have a single architectural style. It wasn't a patron of just modern architecture, but of many other styles as well. But by the post-war period, I think a lot of the architects, and particularly here in the School of Architecture, were very much affected by European developments, the work of Le Corbusier, as well as many others who belong to a group called the International Congress of Modern Architecture, CIAM. The first visitor here that Joseph Murphy, the first modern dean of the School of Architecture, invited here in 1950, the first foreign visitor was Alfred Roth, who was a Swiss CIAM member. There's a picture of him in the exhibition. He designed a very innovative modern school in the suburb of Berkeley up near the airport, which quite remarkably still survives. It's now been repurposed as a church. So there was really a lot of effort to kind of connect new materials, new technologies, new forms to new ideas of political organization. The one-story school, the school that would have more relaxed and pedagogically contemporary methods than the old rigid schools with classrooms where the desks were all bolted into place. Many other examples in all kinds of things. Just the whole idea of the modern airport as something like a train station, but involving all these complex flows of people and luggage and goods and trucks. All of that approached in a way that was really quite different than what previous classical architects were really in a way able to do. And so that was related to democratic ideas, but often I would say in the US, rather vaguely. And so that it's very hard to argue that Pruitt-Igoe, for example, is a truly democratic or politically positive kind of project, I think. And so that's where some of the complexity of the topic comes in.
As I was in practice and traveling, had the opportunity to travel around travel around Europe to see many of these examples that modern architecture came to be known by. I got a chance to go to these places. I went to these iconic neighborhoods that were designed by Le Corbusier and Bruno and Max Taut and Mies van der Rohe, and there is still a community of these workers' housing in, well, everywhere, Vienna, but in particularly, I focused on the Weissenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart because it's the white boxes that were, and here's where the difference was. It's still being used. It's not a museum piece. It's housing. You can walk to the train station from there. You can walk to open space. It's in a neighborhood, and it's supported by the neighborhood around it rather than this disconnected moat of 33 11-story buildings. So I think the idea of where the ideas came from, they're there. They're still there for you to see, but the interpretation of them here has been difficult. They didn't inspire that same sense of connectivity and wonder, but it was a very utilitarian way of getting as many people in housing as possible, but not in a way that would make it a desirable neighborhood.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe just as a comment before we move on to Eric, I think many of these, at least from my knowledge, and that's maybe one of the contradictions of modern architecture as well, many of these concrete slab high-rises that, are housing many inhabitants, they did exist in Europe too, and they also failed. And what is interesting, thinking of Igor Marjanovic, whom I saw here today, is that they did fail in the democracies why they did not fail in the socialist countries. So that would be, also maybe an important point on which another book, another project could elaborate on. But since we are running a little out of time and want to also give you time to ask questions, maybe quickly to combine two of the questions we wanted to address here. One is really and maybe we have answered this already a little bit, and also demonstrated how complex this is, really to talk about the impact of modern architecture on St. Louis in comparison to other American cities. And the other issue we want to also address, and maybe we can combine that, is really the role of the School of Architecture here on campus during the modern period. So sorry for...
Okay, I'll be really brief because I know we don't have a ton of time. I think St. Louis is really interesting in the way this innovative structural aspect is important, the thin shell concrete. Quite different than Mies's influence in Chicago. Mies van der Rohe, very influential in the Chicago region. Not so much here, and I think that's something that could be more, we could think more about that in some ways. There's also this very much highway orientation here that is like Los Angeles or Southern California, and that a lot of these buildings are designed to be seen like the planetarium from the highway. So that's another interesting difference. I think there's a lot more research that could be done. The School of Architecture is remembered as a place of international visitors. There's also very interesting and active teaching and practice, the firm of Smith Enseroth, the former dean, Konstantin Michaelides, many others, Fumihiko Maki, whose first building we're sitting in Steinberg Hall from 1960. And so there's really a lot of layers to that. It's hard to generalize about it simply.
And I think it's amazing, in particular, that so many Japanese Americans and Japanese architects had such an impact here on the school. I'm not sure if that is something other American cities also, or American universities also experienced during that modern period, or if this would be something unique here to WashU and the School of Architecture.
I agree. One of the things I learned while being in school here is we did have these architects coming from all over the world and bringing ideas from Europe and India and England, and it opened our eyes, opened my eyes anyway, to a way of seeing architecture in a broader sense than what was happening in my area code here in St. Louis.
Well, thank you. I think one very important aspect we have not in depth talked about is really the architect Charles Fleming, who received the Dean's Medal back in April, and who unfortunately recently passed away, but who really had a lot of influence through his energetic personality and all the buildings he built here in St. Louis, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco. And you, Michael, were a student of Charles Fleming and worked for Charles Fleming. So maybe that's a good opportunity to talk about his legacy.
Well, briefly, Charles was my mentor, and it turns out a former neighbor in Richmond Heights, which I didn't know until later. But I worked for him on significant projects, yes, some that are still extant, and he showed by example how to build a practice, how to work with cities and other professionals, and to create architecture that was strong, practical, and aspirational. One of the buildings we feature, the Comprehensive Care Center in North St. Louis, I saw after I was already in college. I was walking by our old neighborhood on Belt, and I saw this building, and I said, I want to work for whoever designed that building, and it was Charles. And so I joined him in '76, and in '82, I opened his San Francisco office and opened my own in '88. But it was good to see him here being recognized with the Dean's Medal and a proclamation from the city of St. Louis. I think Vervis Jones sort of elbowed his way into the presentation with the proclamation from the mayor that April 18th was Charles Fleming Day, which you could see he was totally awestruck by. So it's, yeah, he was a figure worth understanding how he built a firm and how the ripple effect that he had on others.
Not much to add to that, except it's really Michael that made all that possible. 5 years ago or something, we were having a conversation, and he said, "You've got to get this guy on videotape, while he's still around." And so we did that. We also brought in Chantel Blakely, who's now at Rice, who has an essay in the Reader about Charles's career. So it's all really, I think, great that that's been possible.
And I think it's the first really important essay about his oeuvre, so don't miss it. It taught me a lot also, again, about how modern architecture in different contexts can play out. I mean, that is one of the strengths, I think, of that essay. Maybe the last question here on the panel is, well, what can we do better today? It's still how to improve St. Louis, how to revitalize communities, how to preserve certain buildings, but not only buildings, but also, as Michael said, to contextualize the buildings so that they really become neighborhoods, are important questions we are asking ourselves, that are asked in the news, that are asked in the newspapers. And we also will do a symposium about that, which happens on October the 25th and 26th. And I have one slide, so while maybe Eric and Michael comment a little bit more on these challenges for the future that are actually included in the exhibition as an epilogue. So maybe you could share your thoughts about that before we open the conversation, and please feel free in the meantime to also look at the symposium agenda, and we hope very much that on the 25th and 26th of October you will be able to join us again.
Yeah, we'd like to thank Meredith Lehman, the head of public education here at the Kemper, and also Matt Bernstein, who runs the Office for Socially Engaged Practice in the Fox School, for organizing this symposium and sponsoring it. We're really fortunate that Toni Griffin, who's an expert on St. Louis, she's a former SOM architect and planner who's been at the Harvard Graduate School of Design for a number of years now, and they've been doing pretty serious studies of St. Louis. So I think it should be a good occasion, really, to come and hear what she has to say, ask questions. A lot of the idea of the symposium is really to start a conversation. So it's not an academic symposium in that sense, that Michael will be there and Chantel Blakely will be there talking about some of the historical material, but a lot of it will be contemporary issues and contemporary concerns.
Katie Hayter is also sharing one of the panels, and so is Linda Samuels. So I think it should be a very interesting begin of a new conversation about St. Louis and the legacy of architecture, not only modern architecture, and those questions of how to move forward. With that, I would, if Michael doesn't want to add anything here, I would love to open the panel discussion to all of you, and I'm sure Michael and Eric will be happy to take some questions. We are a little blinded here, so that's why we're turning this off.
Microphone jig. One that suggests a kind of microcosm, that this city represents a sort of microcosm of planning and urban development in the mid-20th century. The other which suggests it's a case of exceptionalism, right? That it has things about it that are somehow unique. And I see that in particular in some of the way that you set up the introduction, Eric, with, here's Mendelssohn, here's the thin shell concrete. So in certain ways, there are these exceptions, right, within the Midwest, basically, city. On the other hand, there are plenty of examples of the kind of urban renewal that we could look at across the United States. So I'm just curious how you might sort of stand back and give us a kind of, respond to that.
Well, I think it's a sort of two different ways that St. Louis is distinctive. One is the whole Pruitt-Igoe aspect, that becomes symbolic of really something that isn't just about St. Louis, that Robert Moses in New York was clearing actually more territory than here, and certainly the south side of Chicago. And so there are many other examples. So I think that's a difficulty almost if you focus on that, as sometimes people do, as emblematic of St. Louis. They miss these other and more interesting in some ways aspects, which involve these buildings like the Arch, like the Coca, like the airport, Obata's work, and so on. All the role of Buckminster Fuller here is virtually unknown. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do, is not to in some way hide the story of Harlem Bartholomew and the clearances, but also to call attention to this other side of St. Louis. And so it's been, I think, a really rare opportunity to do that, and very important that the Kemper has been supportive of that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, wow. I get some exercise.
What are some of the lessons learned that we're still learning from the exhibit, and with regard to city building and neighborhood building, especially perhaps with respect to the transportation experience we've had regarding expressways and the metro system?
Well, I'm happy to say that a number of cities who suffered through the interstate highway boom are looking at taking those expressways down and reconnecting neighborhoods. The I-10 in New Orleans is one. The expressway in San Francisco that cut San Francisco off from the bay, that's down. It's now a boulevard again. And so we're trying to understand, we can still get to all these places that are important, actually make a better city, and the expressway, the expressway was not just the sole answer to transportation. So I think what we're trying to do, in my view, is that we're trying to learn example by example and see how we can use these precedents to make our cities better places to live.
There's one.
Michael, I wanted to ask about Pruitt-Igoe, since you have the personal experience there. The failure, if you could call it that, of Pruitt-Igoe, you seem to be suggesting it was partly a failure of architecture. But were there other factors that caused that? Was there poor management? Was there a shift in socioeconomic demographics that contributed to the failure? What's your view of what was the panoply of causes that led to that failure?
Well, we don't have time. There, I think, somewhere between Shakespeare and the Bible, there's been more written about Pruitt-Igoe than just about any particular project. And to me, the failures from a distance looking at it were many. The biggest, for me, was this lack of connectivity to what was around, the neighborhood around it. Failure of maintenance, just one example, the aluminum windows on the high rise didn't have governors on them. The wind would take the window, pop it 90 degrees, break it against the brick wall, and up would come plywood, 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 plywood. So it became a very dystopian place to live for all sorts of other reasons. So maintenance was one, and the streets in the sky were a failure. The skip-stop elevators that didn't connect each floor to an elevator was, we can go on. And I'll give you one example of how I know that this wasn't just an American problem. When the wall was still up in Berlin, I went to a 3-day seminar on city building. And it had the usual suspects: Tony Garnier, all of the city concepts about how you build a city. And I walked into the Martin Gropiusbau right at the wall, and there was a wall-to-wall mural of Pruitt-Igoe being blown up. And I thought, I'm never going to get rid of this place. But the point is that it was trying to, they had a certain kind of distance. City building, and here's something that didn't work. Let's try to understand why.
Although one has to say Berlin has the Sozialpalast, and that's not much better. That failed as well. So, they took an excuse here.
They called their Soviet building Soviet chic.
Maybe
In
we
any
should
case-
also just mention that
Yeah.
there's a film being shown in the exhibition on Pruitt-Igoe, the Pruitt-Igoe myth that was made about 15 years ago, that's in the,
in the video gallery, and we intentionally didn't put it in the exhibition because one also has to say that Pruitt-Igoe is a trauma and left traumatic effects on many, and so we thought it should be each visitor's choice to go and see this video or not. I think we have time for one last question to wrap this up, if there is one. Otherwise, it's my pleasure to officially open this exhibition, and I do hope that we will have, there's one more question. No. Whom do I choose the woman, I'm so sorry.
So your presentation got me to thinking about what is the relationship locally, nationally, internationally between architecture, government, and politics. Does architecture drive politics and government? Does government or politics drive architecture?
I'll give you one perspective. When I was studying all this, there was a book written by a St. Louis University professor about Pruitt-Igoe, and he focused on the subjective aspects, the cost of construction, not how it was to live there as housing, but what it was in terms of the kinds of data you could find out about it. And he made an interesting conclusion. It was a remarkably successful housing project, construction project. The concrete that went into that building was several times what was required. The union said no to new forms of heating and put in plumbing that broke down. If you watch the video of it being imploded, and they finally just had to just knock it down, it was built several times strong. So as a construction project, remarkably successful. Construction companies did just fine. As a place to live, not so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Now the exhibition is officially opened, and congratulations again to Michael and Eric.